So let me tell you the book in a nutshell, as Peter said. The first thing is the 1 minute or perhaps a bit more history of Julius Caesar. If you want to summarize it, then his life and career can be summarized in three important periods. There is the first period, the first 40 years of his life, where he was born and raised, which also had an important impact on his leadership later on, and then progressed his career through the ranks of the different formal positions of Roman government until he reached in 59 the top position. And then comes a next period of 9 years, his biggest achievement and one of the things where he was most famous of, the conquest of Gaul, known first of all because he has written himself a lot about it, and some of you may have had the opportunity to read that in school, but it's a big achievement, and we also have the humorous version of that in Asterix. So it's an iconic period of his life and career. And then finally, the last stage, a short period of another 5 years, but in which a lot happened. There is the famous crossing of the Rubicon, which became the archetype of the point of no return into the civil war, which he ultimately won at the end when he became the sole ruler as a dictator of Rome. And finally, we have this tragic assassination, which has also become the archetype of all political assassinations, including got Caesar a place in one of Shakespeare's tragedies. So this very briefly his career, and then what did I do in the book, or what is different of the book, is the fact that I applied several instruments I use and I appreciate using in my own coaching to Julius Caesar. And there are four instruments. One is a leadership timeline, so where you look at, it's an autobiographical instrument where you look at the highs and lows, important events in a person's career, but also in personal life over a time period. And that helps you to see what happens to a person, how that impacts his behavior, but also over time. And that was also interesting with Caesar. You can see if there's certain patterns, certain trends, which tell you something about this particular individual leader. Then another instrument was looking at leadership behaviors, for which I used the Global Executive Leadership Mirror, an instrument which is often used for 360-degree feedback. And it is a list of 12 behaviors from which you can derive strengths and weaknesses of a person. Then the third one is the leadership pipeline, an instrument that allows you to analyze, on the one hand, the career system in an organization, or on the other hand, the career of a leader in a large organization. And it's a way of measuring how career progression grows, but also the importance and the impact of things like leadership brand and reputation on a person's career progression. And then finally, I looked also at Caesar's personality, particularly motivation, for which I used the individual directions inventory. And this measures what a person likes to do and what a person does not like to do. And what you see often happening with leaders is that they tend to do too much of the things they like to do, tend to do not enough of what they don't like to do, even if that would be the most helpful thing to do. And Caesar, in that regard, was no different. In the Q&A later, I'm happy to go into more detail if you wish on instrument, but I'd like to now to give the floor back to Peter, and was keen on asking me a few questions, I believe.
Okay, thanks a lot for this springboard, Paul, serving as a good background for the interview for the next 15, maximum 20 minutes. Paul, Caesar, very clearly is a hero of the past. I think he's been ruling and leading more than 20, not more than 2,000, 2,000 years ago. But what makes him a case for us today? What makes him not only interesting, but relevant for us as contemporaries, very generically?
Well, first of all, I mean, working with a case study is something which has proven to be quite effective in leadership development, whether that's in teaching or even in coaching. So that's one element. The second element is that Caesar is not only successful, and I mean, I've seen that generally in leadership development, one learns better from successful cases than not so successful cases. But Caesar is particularly successful in the broad sense. So if you rank all important leaders in history on several elements like military performance, performance as a in leading a government, organization, performance in innovation or change management, in communication, and even as a writer, then Caesar would always end up in the top five. Perhaps rarely or perhaps never as number one, but often as number two or number three. And there's no one in history who has that breadth of achievements at all those different elements. And I think that makes him stand out and is worthwhile looking at. Yes, he's successful, but he's not perfect. And I think that is also something worth looking at to see, okay, what are the things which make the difference between successful and not being perfect. And finally, relevance. I've worked with historical cases before, and what I see is that because, particularly if you go further back, like in the days of Roman history, societies, economies, organizations were considerably less complex than what we are facing today. And that lower complexity makes it easier to find out or to learn what works and doesn't work as a leader in an organization. And I think that's why it could be helpful to look at those cases.
Paul, let's zoom into the leader role and the leader model. Your book has a very punchy title, Lead Like Julius Caesar, Timeless Leadership Lessons from History's Most Influential Leader. That is quite bold. So you say Caesar is a case for leaders. And if I look at the structure of your book, you structured it along the lifeline of Caesar. So the chapters deal with dedicated phases of his life and career and leadership. So let me pick two phases, an earlier and perhaps the last one. So there's a chapter from high potential to leader, and the last chapter is alone at the top, chairman and CEO. These are two dedicated chapters of the book.
Yeah.
What are the specific lessons a reader or a leader as a reader can extract from these two chapters? So the earlier phase and perhaps the last phase.
Yeah. So if
these might be two questions in one, but choose which one you would like to.
So if you look at that period from high potential to leader, which is mid-career, where he went through the different steps in the Roman Republic, had a formal career structure, just like big corporations have, which is quite exceptional in history. And in that period, so he progressed successfully through that. And I think there are three things one can learn from that example. The first one is that he made sure that he met the objectives of his position, and more than that, to overperform, to go beyond expectations, which he mostly managed, not always, but in most cases he managed, and that positions him well, made him also suitable for the next promotion. But with that, and very much connected with that, is the second thing, to make sure that this performance is visible. So one of the things which makes Caesar stand out is that he was very clear in making sure that everybody knew, the stakeholders, what his performance was. Through that, he also constructed a leadership brand that made him known. And when the next position come up, people knew what he stand for, and that made it easier to choose him. And the third element is that, a leadership career, particularly in a large organization, means that as you grow nearer to the top, then things become more difficult in the sense that there's competition. There's enough candidates, but not enough senior positions. So there's competition, and some of that competition is fair, and some of that competition is unfair. And you need to find a way also to handle that.
So he obviously managed these three topics which you consider relevant quite well, which made him move up
considerable effort.
But what about the last phase, alone at the top, chairman and CEO? What is specific on that phase, and what is for a CEO a key lesson he or she could extract from that chapter in your book?
Yeah, the key is in the word alone. What I mean by that is that alone in the sense of not getting sufficient information and particularly not getting sufficient feedback about what is going on in your organization and to what extent the things you do and the things you decide actually bring about the result that you want. Caesar did not get enough of that, and that was ultimately also the reason for his downfall, because he did not read the signs of dissatisfaction that could have prevented his tragic death. And it was partly has to do with the fact that this is a general phenomenon that the more senior people are, the more difficult people find it, or the more unnecessary sometimes find it to give feedback. But it was also partly his own doing, because one of his flaws, if you will, is that he was not particularly good at inviting people to give him feedback. He was at the top, but without having full knowledge of what was going on.
So he's a good example for this loneliness at the top phenomenon. The
Yes.
CEOs, people shy back from approaching these persons because they're so high. And on the other hand, he was not capable, not empathetic enough to read the emotions, or let me look at Brutus, for example, to walk in the shoes of the important stakeholders around him, the significant others, to read their motivation and to engage with them in a way that they feel part of the game.
Yes, and one of the things was that it's an example of where strengths can become a liability. So one of the things Caesar was very good at was organizing things, being very efficient. That's why he got a lot done in a short period of time. But because of that, for example, he had some people around him who acted as gatekeepers, as filters of information to him, so that he had somebody else, several other people dealing with this flux of information coming to it. It's a very modern thing, come to think of it, and let them sort of decide what filter came through it, but not giving the right criteria to those people of what information they should bring and what not, and what form. Let those people to decide themselves what they bring to him or not. And also was a major factor that he did not get the critical information that he needed.
Yeah. Paul, you mentioned that strong word already, this famous Rubicon moment. And the chapter you're dealing with, you headlined it, No Turning Back. How followers can push a leader to ... What's the key lesson in there? What's the key lesson in Rubicon?
Yeah, the key lesson there is that followers can be biased in the information they give you, and particularly they have their own agenda. And particularly if you have a group of followers in one direction, which is perhaps not particularly diverse, there may be a tendency that they tell you and advise you things which are in their own interest, which may not necessarily in the leader's interest, or let alone in the organization he has to lead. So I think there again, with insufficient and particularly biased information, led Caesar to push himself across the Rubicon, as if he had taken the opportunity to be more engaged directly in negotiation and talk directly with his counterparts. The outcome may have been different, and the compromise could have been.
But Paul, this Rubicon, this is a concrete, it's a river, isn't that? And this was kind of crossing that river, kind of crossing the red line, which brought him directly into the civil war.
Yes, it was illegal to cross that river because it was the border between the province or the area which Caesar was managing as a governor and the formal Roman territory. And because Rome was scared of military leaders taking part, it was illegal for a general to cross with soldiers into that border. He would have, if he wanted to do that, he would have stepped back from his command first for a moment. Yeah.
But he followed his followers and he crossed because he felt that he had to do that because it was an expectation of his followership.
Yes, and he was thinking that this was the only way, on the one hand, to commit to his followers, but also because the information he had received through his followers who were in Rome was biased to the extent that there is no compromise possible. And if you don't do this, then people will come after you. And Caesar said, well, I have to do this. Yeah.
Very good. My last focus for the interview, Paul, is Caesar is a case for leadership developers and coaches as well. That's what I got out of my reading. And this is what you offer here as well. But tell us a bit more. How does reading the book for those who are active coaches or leadership developers, how does reading that book inform their leadership development practice, their coaching, and how can that help to do their job better, more innovative, or what are the elements you consider helpful and practical for the coaches and leadership developers?
Yeah, this as always, first of all, I think it's a case study of a successful leader who everybody looks at as very successful without necessarily knowing that behind that success, there are some challenges and difficulties which are hidden if you don't look at it systematically. In that regard, it can help coaches to see how such a career has developed, and particularly help in that respect, be more aware when they work with clients of these hidden aspects which can become quite important or difficult for the client. In my own coaching experience, I've seen that sometimes it helps to bring different elements into your coaching, which can be a case study like this one, or it can also something from art or literature or from films. And that can be particularly helpful is if the client is stuck, and a way to look at the things, to reframe the situation, to give the opportunity to look at things in a different way, to break that deadlock and progress into a more beneficial coaching track.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Bombarded you with questions.
That's what I mean.
That's what my job was. So I think if I get, it's 5:31. I would love to open the floor to questions and comments. And there were already two animating ones. I see Elko here heading Christina.
Yeah.
Let's do the ladies first and give Christina the first question, and then you. And then, Klaus, we can come back to your question whether Trump has read the book already. I would make the assumption that this guy doesn't read books anyway. But so, Christina.
One thing that triggered me particularly, and which I found highly useful, was the GELM results in different phases of Caesar's career.
So the GELM, for those who are not familiar, is a global executive leadership mirror. This is the 360 instrument 360. Which we use, and, which is used here.
And you see, so it's in dimensions of the self, the team, the organization at large, and the broader networks inside and outside a person's organization. You have done let's say, the yardstick, the measurement along this GELM in various phases of Caesar's career. And what you see is actually, because we silently assume that through experience and career, a person always becomes more competent. What you see here actually is the competence shifting, and that a person can even lose competence in a next situation. So I found that interesting, instead of what you somehow suppose is a gradual growth into becoming more competent. You see, it's actually, you become less competent in certain areas. I think of emotional intelligence, which scored a reasonable score in the beginning of his career and then walked into the red zone because probably lack of feedback. But any thoughts around that, Paul? Because I find that highly interesting, and I would love to see that throughout an executive's career, and we seldom have the opportunity.
Absolutely. That was also the reason why I did that, to see if something like that's happened. And I found it indeed interest to see that it does happen, these changes over time. I think there are two things. On the one hand, a certain competency like emotional intelligence or team building, whatever, that when you enter a next phase into career, and particularly when you take a higher responsibility, the requirements for that competency change or become bigger, if you will. So you need to grow to able and develop yourself so that you're able to develop that competence at the level that's required. That's one thing, but it also is the competency becomes different, not necessarily bigger or smaller, but different, that are new, different requirements, which means that within that same competency, you need to grow into being able to apply that competency at a higher quality or at a higher level, but also differently, which also sometimes I mean that you need to let go of certain things which you have learned in the past and which were useful for a certain position, but for the next position it may not. And I think those two things, that it's growing, but also letting go in the learning process, is very important. And I think there, the learning, to come back to Peter's question earlier about what coaching have read, if there is an opportunity, which indeed we as coaches really have, but it's something which we can recommend to our clients, that it is helpful to look at those same companies over several stages in the career and to do 360, not every 10 years, but every 2 or 3 years, to see if your growth pattern matches.
A lesson I took from it is be mindful of not coaching about the past, but be sure you coach about the now and the tomorrow.
Very good point. Yeah, where do you want to go?
I think unconsciously we are at risk of doing so, because the data we have often might come from the past, not sufficiently into the future, and see what a person's learnability is, which is actually a key factor.
Yeah.
Let's listen.
Thanks for reminding me of.
No, thanks, Christina, for opening up the question round. Let's go to Elko's question, and then I see 3 very inspiring and interesting questions in the chat. We might go to them afterwards. But Elko.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul, first of all, for the presentation and writing the very interesting book. Looks like Christina already has it. I don't. But I would like to ask you, what was your inspiration to study specifically Julius Caesar? That's the first question. And the second one is, using these 4 tools, these coaching tools, were there any surprises that came up?
Yeah. So with regard to Caesar, so Caesar has been with me throughout my career. In my dissertation, I studied history. He was one of the Roman leaders I studied. And at that time, he was, for me, a political leader who was more successful than others, but that's about it. I came across him later, did a study about the comparison between a Roman crisis of his time and the financial crisis, and saw some different aspects of Caesar which I hadn't seen before, and which made him more complex. And then later on in the book, which Peter earlier mentioned, I came across Caesar again as the manager of Cleopatra, discovered new things about it. So when you're thinking about what I'm going to do next, I think, this person is much more complex and multidimensional than I thought, and let's dig into it. And I think that's what I found in this book. Now, with regard to the other question, surprises, one of the things, when there are 2, one we mentioned already, this impact of followers on very important strategic decisions. And the other one was the importance of his early youth and upbringing. And it's something, that's the reason why I like to work with clients, if I have the opportunity, with some autobiographical instruments. But here again, it was one of the confirmation, in other ways, a surprise how important that was. And it's on the one hand, that the fact that he in his youth lived through a very violent period, which had a significant impact on the way he led later and on his values. And the other one was the importance of his family, and notably his mother, in how he was shaped as a leader, but also in his motivation and ambition. That was really, really fundamental. So you see these seeds of both the success and the failure later on being in that early life of the first 15, 20 years.
Thank you.
I'd like to go to Selina's, then Klaus's. Selina, are you ready for it? Do you want me to read that, or do you want to rephrase it? Or
I think
the
discussion even moved further. I was still thinking about Christina's remark about past and present. I think it would be an extra topic to explore a bit more. But I don't know enough about Julius Caesar. I'm one of these pupils who have read and heard a bit about him in school. So I will be delighted to read your book, Paul. And I'm almost a bit ashamed to use this overused concept of narcissistic leadership, but there's something in it luring behind it, isn't it? So my question was, because it was a term you used, Peter, when you said shying away from giving feedback from follower side is one thing. And I wondered how inviting he was concerning others to give him feedback. Yeah. So how much hybris was there involved as far as we know nowadays? And could he be said to be a rather narcissistic person with rather narcissistic traits? On the other hand, you explored his very good social skills. So was this counterbalanced? I would be interested to hear a bit more about it.
Yeah. So with regard to narcissism, I mean, there was an element in that, and I think any successful leader needs to have an element of narcissism to be successful. But in Caesar, it was not in any way that was particularly exaggerated or detrimental. What was an important motivation in him was recognition. So he liked to get a title, liked to be applauded, he liked to get a victory parade, a triumph for his victories. He enjoyed that, but that was more in the sense of recognition. Whereas narcissism can also be a motivation without having done something, but just getting a compliment. And that was certainly not the case with Caesar. With the case with feedback, it was not somebody who did not want to receive feedback. And therefore, also, I would not call him an exaggerated narcissist. The problem was more with him is that he was, on the one hand, very fast and efficient. So he didn't give people the time to give him feedback. He was also not really, whether he wanted to or didn't know how, that's difficult to say, but he was not normally safe on go to his people, what do you think? Tell me, give me some feedback. He was not like that. But I think an important factor for him was, and I think that's a very important lesson also for other leaders, is that you have this phenomenon where we say, well, people find it difficult to speak truth to power. And that certainly played a role, but there's also another phenomenon. There's some research I quote in my book, which is very interesting about that, is that when the followers see a leader who's very self-confident, and Caesar certainly was that, they think, well, perhaps he doesn't need my feedback. I mean, he's in that position and he must be there for a reason. And if he shows himself that, well, who am I to give him feedback? And that holds people back to give feedback. And if you then on the other hand have a leader who's not necessarily saying, please, please, please give me your feedback, then yeah, it falls in between, and the result is that the leader may not get enough.
Thank you.
I'd like to go to Klaus. Klaus, focusing more on the political arena. Yeah. Klaus.
I was wondering, in these present times where the militarization of our news is quite obvious, to choose a military guy as a hero who clearly broke the legal laws of his time and his state and split his country up to a national war within the country, how can that be our hero? And if we compare that to Donald Trump, is he on the same way, or did he misunderstand the message of your book, whether he read it or not?
So first of all, I never call Caesar anywhere in the book, and neither do I now, a hero. Yeah? He is a successful leader, if you look at different career, but I would not call him a hero. Neither would I call him a role model for the same reasons. But he's a successful leader, and that's why it's worth studying. The other thing is, you mentioned the illegal crossing of the Rubicon, which I mentioned earlier. It was a very messy situation. So the situation is where Caesar indeed crossed the Rubicon illegally. What happened in Rome with the Roman government was equally illegal. And in that regard, the jury is still allowed to say from who was the most illegal, whether it was the people in Rome who took decisions that were contrary to the will of the people, for example, and contrary to the laws, or whether it was Caesar who crossed the border, which he was not supposed to cross. Yeah, I think that there's a lesson there in terms of, as well, in those messy situations. And that message is, on the one hand, that you have indeed from both sides, Caesar's side and his adversaries, the situation where followers with their own interest pushing their leader towards a conflict. The other thing is that the lack of communication between the top leaders, because they never spoke face to face, and that also led to an escalation, in my view. Your question about Trump, I don't know whether he has read it. I hope he will. He may take some cues from that, which may be to the benefit of us. But I think there's some phenomenon there as well. What you see, for example, with Trump is this situation with the impact of followers who want to go further than the leader. And an interesting case when Jeff Bezos intervened in the Washington Post he owned to apply some kind of censorship to the editorial board that they couldn't talk anymore about certain things. And that was well before Trump did anything in that regard himself, and he still has not done anything in that regard. We have done many things with the press, but he has not applied any form of censorship. So you have there this Bezos wanted to please Trump and going further than Trump shows. And in that respect, there's a phenomenon where, I mean, we think of Trump as somebody who does this and that and decides, but I believe behind there is also a group of followers who push him in a direction which may be sometimes not the one he would choose himself.
Very good. So far, so good. Look, we have 5 more minutes. I want to be mindful with the time. If there ain't a burning, very important question. Magdalena?
I would have a question as well, because I also didn't have privileged insights and don't know the book yet. So what would you say is one message that when we read the book, we should really take away with us? What is like the one lesson where you say this is really the priority? We should not do that. We should do that as leaders. What is that for you?
If I choose one, then I would say watch your back. And what I mean with that is that, yeah, you need to be aware that there is things going on under the surface, particularly irrationally, emotionally in your organization you may not be aware of. And it's important that you are aware of that. So to have your feelers out there, which can be formally through feedback process, employee surveys or town hall meetings, but also through individuals you assign, that you make sure that you pick up in time any signs of dissatisfaction so that you either can explain better what you're doing or these particular issues.
Magdalena, I find this a quite great question, helping me to provide you all with my summary on my reading. So I had the opportunity to read the book because I got it as the facilitator. Can you see the slides here? Why this book? It's value for the reader. And Stefan, I would even say it's a value for a high-tech leader in SAP. I'm sure and confident there are many people who read philosophy and know in SAP and are interested in history. So 3 things for me, which I find of value for the reader. So profiling Julius Caesar with these 3 personality and career development models makes a leader of the past our contemporary. I think the work of translating the leadership behavior of Caesar into modern terminology and model-based terminology is really of value. Examining Julius Caesar's behavior, what he did, his career, how he progressed, and his motivations, why he did what he did, addresses 3 core questions of leadership development practice. And last but not the least, benchmarking, comparing against Julius Caesar is of particular value. His imperfect success story is both inspirational and realistic. So he's not an anti-hero, but he is a strong leader who kind of failed personally because he got assassinated.